Introducing Wrist Time. Uncover your own behaviors, trends, and preferences, experiencing your collection in a new way. Log specific dates, activities, and adventures with your watches. Gain collection insights with your personal wear metrics and discover trends within our global community of 1916 Company collectors, destined to become your newest habit. Download the 1916 Company app and its new features to start tracking today.
Hi everybody, Jack Forster, Global Editorial Director for the 1916 Company, and I'm here once again with Eleonor Piccioto, our czar of jewelry, I guess you might say. And we're going to talk about a subject that I think a lot of watch enthusiasts have been exposed to and might think they know something about, but as with so many things in life, it turns out that there's quite a lot more to talk about than certainly I had thought. And making these videos has been an interesting process for me because typically we have a conversation before we start shooting and I'm like, oh, okay, so I don't actually know anything about this thing that I've been writing about so blithely for many years. So today the subject is?
The usual suspects. That's how I'm actually stealing this line from you because when we started mentioning ornamental stones, as we actually call them, which I'm referring to the usual turquoise, malachite, lapis, and onyx that we've been seeing in a lot of jewelry collections, but most recently, I would say, but even back in the 60s and 70s, when you'd look at like vintage pieces, those were the gemstones that were usually like ornates, either a dial or a detail or a crown. And the first question I actually asked the brand is, why do you keep using those same 4 colors? They're like, well, because of sourcing, for the matter, there are large quantities that we can find that we can easily source, trace, and work on. Obviously, we can get into, and we'll get later into the opals, the mother of pearls, the tiger's eye, and even up to chrysocolla, which is a dial we've seen recently in one of the Ulysse Nardin divers gem set hardstone dials.
And these hardstone dials had a bit of a vogue in the 60s and 70s, and then they kind of fell into disuse, I think, a little bit. And they're now enjoying a little bit of well, more than a little bit of a revival. They're having a very big comeback, and people are starting to look at them again and discover them again. We're starting to see brands put out new versions of older watches. You know, the Piaget Andy Warhol is a great example. But
what's actually interesting is, obviously, all these stones have been used for decades. There's nothing new, even though the trend of stone dials have become like back into it, where men and women do enjoy and are actually looking for them. But when you look at now the availability and how stones are being used, probably one of the most interesting examples are Lapis Lazuli, because right now most of the big groups brand will tell you right in the eyes that they won't be able to get more because supply, because sourcing, because of traceability. I was told at a gem fair that a lot of the mines were now being taken up by the Taliban, which kind of are blocking the access of getting the proper stone that you want to get. And also because the mines are becoming older, so the actual first material, raw material, has become harder to find.
So they're being mined out, number one, and number two, a lot of the mines are in Afghanistan. They're in conflict areas.
Exactly.
And you know, my exposure to lapis lazuli was when I was an art student. You know, back when dinosaurs ruled the earth. And I found out that lapis lazuli was used as a basis for the pigment aquamarine in fine art. And it was very, very rare and very expensive because if you wanted to do an altarpiece, for example, in a Renaissance painting, you wanted to do Mary's robe in this beautiful, beautiful sky blue, which was considered the signature color. But in order to create that blue pigment, you would have to import lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and the process of purifying it and making it into a pigment was very complex. And if you wander around Italy and look at some of the great art that was produced during the Renaissance, you'll see some of these works of art were not completed because they simply ran out and they couldn't get any more of it.
And also, when you look at lapis, the different quality, the different kinds, the rare and the most expensive one are the one who are really like navy blue with fragments of gold, which is technically pyrite. And the more pyrite you have, the more celestial the stone will look like. When you look at high jewelry necklaces, especially the beads that you would see at VCA or you could see at Cartier, if you find some buy them, because it's less likely that these brands will be able to create more because of that supply.
So you think that, in your view, the supplies of lapis lazuli there's no sort of short-term solution to the problems with the supply chain. This is
no, because even if it's a conflict zone, there's then again the supply and how much more there's left in those mines, and that's something that we've been hearing for the last years, that a lot of those mines are running out.
Yeah.
And when you look at the other three usual suspects like Malachite, Onyx, and Turquoise, there's plenty of them.
Plenty of those.
Yes.
It seems odd. I'm sure that there's somewhere there's a geologist who could give us a good explanation, or you might not actually know. Why is it that this mineral is so relatively rare in terms of location?
That's a very good question. I don't know, but I would assume, like many gemstones that are just sourced in one place, they're just sourced there because of the habitat, because of the temperature, because of the change in temperature, which is also what gives the color in some gemstones, because of all the raw materials that basically creates the composition of what the stone is made of. And I remember meeting a guy who discovered, it was the first mine that was discovered in the 21st century, and it was a mine that was located somewhere in Africa, and he didn't want to disclose it. It was called aquaprase, which is kind of a mix of aquamarine and chrysoprase with like a little bit of chalcedony to give you a sense of what the stone would actually look like.
It sounds amazing.
And it is amazing, and the supply is still quite short because there's only one mine, and he doesn't want to take everything so that in a few years from now there won't be anything left, which is also why he doesn't disclose where it is precisely on the map, because he doesn't want anyone to come and just take everything. Which is why gemstones not only is a fascinating topic to talk about, but that's why it brings out emotion, rarity, and uniqueness, because it's a material that's being created from the earth that you can't control, whether where to find it, how much to find it, the quality of how you want to mine it. So it's a really interesting world, I want to say, you can dive into.
It is sort of interesting that we actually don't typically, as a group, watch enthusiasts typically don't understand the problems with rarity and with sourcing these gemstones.
Well, when you think about the rarity and sourcing them is one thing, but let's say tomorrow I want to tell you that I want to make an aquaprase dial for a watch. No matter how much supply you have, then comes down to the hardness of the stone and how much like fragmented or how easily breakable or how porous the stone can be, which is also a big headache for a lot of watch brands. Speaking of Ulysse Nardin, when they wanted to introduce a new stone aside from the four usual suspects, and they wanted to use chrysocolla. Chrysocolla is this very interesting turquoise greenish stone where a lot of things happening, but it's laser cut in order to get the extreme thinness in order to fit the dial in the case of the watch. And it was such a headache for them because the stone kept on breaking. And the thinner you get, obviously the more fragile it becomes, but even if you have a big block and you want to slice it, it's likely that some chunks of stone might break in the middle. And when it breaks in the middle, the block that was able to feed you with maybe 50 dials will now feed you 0 because it's broken in half. And that's the difficulty also of why they have been using onyx, malachite, turquoise, and lapis for so long. It's just because they've learned and they've managed how to master the cut and the drilling process of those stones without having too much loss.
Right.
Because you also need to be concerned about that.
So the fact that these four hard stones have been used for watch dials and are commonly used for watch dials throughout the industry, it doesn't have to do just with the availability of the material. It has to do with the fact that the industry, it's a known quantity at this point. It's a problem that's well understood. They're chemically stable, they are relatively hard, and the industry knows how to handle them. And with lapis lazuli, what you're looking for specifically is if you're trying to evaluate qualitatively a lapis lazuli dial, what you're looking for is this deep navy blue color and the presence of these pyrite inclusions, which give it a little bit of texture and a little bit more interest than if it were just sort of a flat blue.
100%. And which is interesting is the transition to turquoise, for example, which is one of my favorite subjects. As you can see, I'm wearing this like massive turquoise necklace.
This is a spectacular piece. And turquoise has been used as an ornamental stone, as you said, for thousands of years.
And you know why is that?
No.
Because turquoise has been considered for centuries, if not more, as the sacred stone. It's the stone that when you believe in the power of stones, and I don't want to get too witchy about it, but a turquoise is in ancient civilization, in Native American population, turquoise helps you cure a disease, an illness, some pain, which is why a lot of them wear them and you have to treat them. You have to clean them, there's different process, you have to discharge and recharge in terms of energy. It's a super powerful stone.
It's one of the things that you mentioned, specifically when we were looking at this necklace, was that turquoise has a tendency to start showing a patina.
When they're natural.
Natural.
One thing you often hear when you talk about gemstones, whether they're precious or color gemstone or ornamental stone, there's no treatment, no heat, no oil, no alteration whatsoever that makes the rarity of this stone so beautiful, so perfect, and sometimes so pricey. When it comes to turquoise, you have either stabilized or natural turquoise. And when the turquoise is stabilized, it means that it was, and it still is to some extent, a natural turquoise, but we've added some sort of resin in order to stabilize the color so that over time you won't get any patina. Because a natural turquoise, just like the one I'm wearing, over time can get this like little green or little yellow patina on the original stone. And as a big brand who sells high jewelry pieces with turquoise, if a client spends X amount of money on a piece day one, he or she doesn't want 10, 15, or 20 years later have his or her piece alterated because of the natural patina that you would get. So, even though some people are looking for that, but it's very hard as a brand to not be able to master and control what can or cannot happen to a piece.
So what's happening with the turquoise, which the color of turquoise comes partly from the copper content. So what's going on? Does the copper continue to sort of oxidize over time, and that's what produces the patina?
It depends on your variety of turquoise. First of all, you need to know that there's more than 70 different varieties of turquoise.
70.
More than 70.
70. All right, so let's just start covering them.
Well, I don't have my cheat sheet, so I have a lot of things written here, but not all the different lines. If you hear about Sleeping Beauty, Sleeping Beauty has been a very popular and famous mine. Sonoma Gold mine, like from which my turquoise are coming from, has this particularity of having a turquoise that's slightly green with like hints of yellow. There's only 2 or 3 varieties in Arizona that have those. You can see spider webs turquoise. You can see so many. And what's really interesting, and I'll just finish on that, is when you think about turquoise as a watch collector perceives it, or what you have seen on windows and catalogs of the watches that have been coming out, it's always the same turquoise that you see. It's this very pure, clean, swimming pool-like blue, which some people describe as plastic blue because it almost looks fake. But that, again, that's what brands are looking for, because you cannot get twice the same turquoise whenever there are nerves or there's like details on it, which makes them unique. But when you produce a series means that all of them need to be the same.
Right. So obviously, if a brand is going to produce anything in series, even a small series, you want consistency in turquoise, for instance, in terms of inclusions and saturation from one watch to the next. But that does give us the impression that it's kind of a monotonous material, because every time we look at turquoise on a watch dial, it tends to be the same kind of turquoise, and they all tend to sort of look alike.
Besides, AP, who 2 years ago introduced a royal oak in yellow gold with a turquoise dial, and they said it because I remember I was seeing 2, and one had like this silver, almost like sparkly diamond line within the dial, and on the other it was just a couple, like a little cloud on the side. And they exactly said we wanted like a different variety of turquoise, different from all the ones that we generally see in jewelry or watches, in order to make it even more unique. And I love that idea. And I think it was the first time I saw, other than a plastic blue turquoise, being used on a watch dial.
We've talked about lapis, we've talked about turquoise, and the third usual suspect?
I would say onyx. what's interesting about onyx is a lot of people tend to assume that it's the only black stone that there is. Obviously, we've seen in the last couple of years black diamonds, but I've learned that during the Indian market, which is the Turquoise Week in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that happens every beginning of August, that jet, J-E-T, was the first black stone, natural black stone ever found in the world. And those were very popular in Native American culture, alongside with turquoise and a little bit of coral that they would set on silver jewelry. But jet is not as precious, as pure, and as deep as the onyx that we find on an MBNF flying T piece, or on even Moser. Even though Moser has used the Vanta black technique, black is always a very hard color to get, whether it's from enamel, whether it's from any other technique, and onyx give that option quite an easy way of using them.
Yeah, onyx is the onyx styles that I've seen have been, there's something very distinctive about them. There's a lot of depth to the blackness. There's a lot of, I mean, it's very saturated, but it doesn't look flat. And I mean, Vanta black is a fascinating material, but once you sort of realize what you're looking at, you know, and you understand that it's a material that's been specifically designed to absorb as much light as possible, you know, the blackest material ever created.
Of course.
It doesn't give you the same, it's a different effect. I don't want to say better or worse, but it gives you a different sense, a visual sense, than the depth and sense of texture that you get with onyx, which is not always a monolithically black mineral, right? I mean, there's banded onyx.
True. It's true. But when you compare an onyx dial next to an enamel grand feu black dial, which has required a certain amount of hours of cooking time and of layers to an extreme degree of mastering the craftsmanship, it's actually very subtle. And even and obviously I don't know everything, but sometimes I have a hard time when I have the two next to one another, figuring out which one which is which.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that, speaking of telling the difference between different kinds of materials, one thing that comes up for me fairly frequently is the glass known as goldstone, which has a natural analog. You know, and this material is something that we've seen used, you know, quite a bit in modern watchmaking. And you know, interestingly enough, the glass actually precedes the stone that it was named after. You know, and working with the glass rather than the actual stone gives you a better sense of consistency. It gives you much more consistency, you know, through a large production.
But also, black is something that nowadays obviously is being worn by men and women. But sometimes the black kind of reduces the effect of, yes, you have a hard stone dial, which could be considered kind of jewel watch. But if you put an onyx dial, there's nothing jewelry about it because it's very monochrome, it's very dark, it's very, very simple and yet super elegant, and it matches really well whether it's a white gold or yellow gold. It's actually really interesting.
Oh, I said goldstone before, which might be a little confusing. That's another name for aventurine glass.
And aventurine glass can come also in different colors. We've seen it in orange, we've seen it in blue, we've seen it in green. So yes, I mean, we can have more stones to talk about. I guess malachite, which incidentally is my least favorite stones, just because I don't like green, generally speaking. But what's interesting about malachite is that you can find loads of them. They are not very expensive because it's part of those stones where you can find like very large amounts of carats, and you can get a quite reasonable price, which enables you to be very creative because you're not as afraid to lose a chunk or not be able to refine another one. And I was briefly explaining in one of our latest videos that I visited Bulgari's new manufacturer dedicated on métier d'art, and one of the 4 dedicated ateliers is the marquetry of hard stone, but 90% of it, close to it, is only with malachite. And we've seen a lot of malachite dials on many watches over time, and you can see that there's like those lines, and those lines are very different from one dial to another. It's impossible to get always the exact same pattern with the exact same green hues.
So this is malachite is a situation where if you're going to work with it for watch dials, you have to accept the fact, and you have to kind of celebrate the fact that they're not going to look alike, that each one is going to be different.
Yep. Which is also why it's been fondly accepted, and people know that there's never going to be 2 dials that are exactly the same. Yet you can play around with the different lines, with the different hues. And what they've been doing in the marquetry is they've been literally crushing the stone, and then like a puzzle, they're just playing around so that it's completely uneven, and you can play and you feel like you have different stones put in it. It's just different parts of that very same stone that gives a texture around it.
So these malachite marquetry dials that you were just describing, are these can these be created in series?
Yeah,
I mean,
100%. But in series, but each one is going to be different.
Right, right.
But yes, you will still have this marquetry where they put and they fill in the entire space of the dial, and then from what's coming out, they literally cut the edge in the round sense, and then they apply some sort of varnish in order to make sure that it doesn't stand out and doesn't slide in. And there's a lot of things that can be done, and I'm sure later on you can do the same thing with turquoise, with different, because obviously just like any other stone, turquoise, even though there's 70 plus different shades or families or whatever you name it, some are more expensive than others because some can be found in large amounts and other can be found in tiny ones. So it's really, it's another one of those stones that are fascinating, just like opals.
So yeah,
Another big one.
that's another big one. So for all of these, I mean, one of the things that I've kind of been learning from the conversations we've had over the last couple of days is that you tend to think going in, if you have a little bit but not much knowledge of gemstones, of precious stones, you tend to think when you talk about things like turquoise, or when one talks about things like turquoise, that there are objective criteria for what constitutes good and bad. But it's a little more complicated than that, isn't it? Because you can have, if you've got 70 plus different varieties of turquoise, for instance, you can't point to one of those 70 and say that's the best all the time under every circumstance. It really depends on what kind of effects you want to achieve and what the overall design is.
And that's the beauty, I'm going to say, of most color gemstones. It's very subjective. A ruby, and we're talking about a precious stone, we're talking about one of the most sought after gemstone. If you show me a pigeon blood ruby, I'll tell you, sure, it's beautiful, but it's too intense. I like when it's a little more like pinkish raspberry look. It's subjective. You'll tell me that the one I like is worth X amount of carat and the other one is 1,000 times more expensive. Well, it's just the way I perceive things.
Right.
It's not black or white like diamonds where you have a certificate, you know, that the purest form is D there, and then it can go back, it can go down all the way up to Z, which gives this like very yellowish color. With color gemstone, it's the beauty of it. And that's why it was the anecdote I was telling you about when I think it was the first time I visited Tucson in Arizona for the gemstone show, and it was one of the biggest, I think it was Kingstone Mine turquoise. And in front of me was a group of I guess the gem department of one of the big jewelry houses. And they came, it's like, oh, we have this beautiful high jewelry necklace. We need the most beautiful turquoise you have.
Right.
And he looked at them and was like, what do you mean the most beautiful turquoise? Like, yeah, I want like a cabochon, that it's going to be a centerpiece. I want this, you know who we are. I was like, sure, but what do you mean? Because what's beautiful to you is not necessarily going to be beautiful to me. And the guy from the studio looked at it and was like, well, I want the perfect blue that has like no defaults, no nothing. And the guy looked at it and was like, oh yeah, you want the plastic blue turquoise, like whatever. And I remember the face of the team and the face of the guy who was the owner of the mine from 3 generations on. And it was like, yeah, for me it's the worst turquoise that can be on the market, but if the most beautiful to you, hey, you're the guys. And I thought it was a very interesting perception because what's beautiful to one is not necessarily to the other. And it's the beauty of the whole gemstone industry.
You know, it reminds me a little bit of, and this is a problem that some people kind of, or an experience some people have to go through when they start collecting watches. You know, when you first start out, you tend to gravitate towards things that you think you should like because so many other people seem to like them. And then after a while, you start to develop sort of your own taste. You know, if you're lucky enough, you get to the point where you like something because yes, you have an education, yes, you understand some of the qualitative differences between different kinds of watches, but you're also not necessarily bound by what everybody else likes. And so if we're talking about diamonds, you know, with diamonds, you know, and I speak under correction, but we have, you know, with diamonds, we have, you know, a very, very kind of specific system of grading diamonds in terms of clarity, the number of inclusions. But with colored stones, it seems as if there are things, obviously, that the market will value more, But what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that there needs to be room for expression of personal taste as well. And just because the market happens to value a pigeon's blood ruby with a deep saturated, blood red color more than, something with a lighter color or something that's a little bit more purplish in hue, that doesn't mean you necessarily have to like the same thing that the market values.
Exactly, and at the end of the day, is what speaks to you. And the interesting part is when you go visit those gem shows and you know nothing about it, which is how I started 8 years ago. But thankfully, I had people who showed me things and taught me a lot of things. But first of all, they would give you a batch of opals, for example, and they say, pick one. It's like, but how do you know? Like, pick one. Your eye will go directly. That's because of the refraction. That's because of the way you see things. And sometimes you've got the good eye because you pick the exact right stone amongst hundreds. And sometimes the one that you like is more cloudy, so it's a little more mysterious. It's worth almost nothing, but hey, you like
But
it.
you thought it was interesting.
And
Yeah.
I've done so many pieces of jewelry where the actual setting costs 100 times more than the actual stone. I don't really care. I like the center stone, and I've done this exercise with the turquoise ones where I found two, and one is like, well, this one is $5, this one is $75. It's like, but they're the same size. Like, yeah, but quality is different, and that's what you picked. So it's always also an interesting perception that a lot of people tend to think, I don't have enough money to buy a real gemstone, whether it's a turquoise, a diamond, whatever. Truth is, you can. At any price, at anything, your eye will just tell you what you want to buy. So,
Opal, parenthetically, opal is an interesting material for you to bring up because it's not something that I think we see terribly often in watchmaking.
It's still something that a lot of watchmen's have used. At some point, I realized when the whole vibe of feminine watches or ladies' watches, because before it became the whole neutral, gender neutral type of watches, after having gone through the path of, okay, we're going to do a ladies' watch and we're going to do a mother of pearl dial with diamonds in the bezel. When it was not this, we had a little bit of adventure in, but opals came really close after that.
Really?
Yeah, and one of the reasons that the supply of opals is actually quite easy, that it depends on the quality of the intensity of the hues, whether it's Ethiopian, Mexican, or even Russian opals, but most of them are actually from Australia.
Yeah.
And you have the black and white opals. And black and white opals is just in a position that the black opals are technically blue, like intense vivid blue, and white opals are the white opals. Fire opals, which are like very vibrant because they have a lot of orange, a lot of pink, a lot of green into it, those are very hard to find, which is why we've rarely seen fire opals in watches.
So, Eleanor, we've talked about the four usual suspects, quote unquote, and we've talked about how the relative ease of sourcing the material, and the fact that the industry knows how to work with these materials pretty well those are two of the reasons why they're more widely used. But two other materials which are also widely used in the industry are meteorite and mother of pearl. We see a lot of both of them, and I'm kind of curious. Mother of pearl has the capacity to be kind of a cliche material. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think constitutes an actual interesting use of mother of pearl?
So I think nowadays it's a little too late to become more interested in it, in a sense that I think it has been overused and used not necessarily in the best possible way, just because for years, whenever a brand wanted to create the feminine version of an existing timepiece, they would just put a mother of pearl dial and diamonds in the bezel. And I think these would be out of just being practical and easy, but zero creativity, zero difficulty, zero nothing. It was just, okay, they wanted one. It's like a minimal portion of our business. We still need to do it, so we'll do it this way. And
so it wasn't really used so much for its inherent qualities
for the
as a
actual
material.
beauty and strength.
It was just used as a way of signaling, hey, this is a lady's watch.
Exactly. So now everybody has been assuming that a mother of pearl dial is for women. But even though I've been in the jewelry industry, I've learned to love and admire pearls very late in the game. It's only when I got to French Polynesia, when I was backpacking across the Pacific. I was blogging at the time and it was raining the entire summer. So all I was doing was diving and visiting pearl farms. And then I started learning about the actual process of how a pearl is being made. And that's something that not a lot of people know about. And the whole complexity of it is not only time, but also all the differences that are things that you cannot control, which means weather, temperature, and water. And you basically need to take an oyster. It's a specific oyster, which I will not take because I will probably get it wrong. It's a very, very long word. But you basically put a nucleus, which is an American pearl from not unsalty water river from Mississippi. You put it inside the oyster. That oyster you put in the water for 6 months. After 6 months, you realize and you check if that tiny little bead didn't get out as like a rejection, and then you put it back on for another 1.5 years. So after 2 years, you bring it back into the water, you get the pearl out of it, and you only get it when there was a drastic change in water temperature from winter to summer. That's when you get the color of your pearl. And for black pearls, for the matter, we call it black pearls in opposition to white pearls, kind of the same thing with opals. But what's interesting in the black pearls is that you have a range of colors. You have peacock, you have turquoise, you have gray, you have pinkish, you have eggplant, kind of the aubergine purple look. And these colors, you only get them because of the temperature. And when you get harvested all those pearls and you put them next to one another, if you don't pay attention, you're like, yeah, they're all black pearls. When you look at them, you can actually create a rainbow of black pearls where you see the subtlety of each color. And I think this is something that the watch industry has completely missed out, because when you actually tell the story of how you get the color, how you basically carve out from the oyster, because this is how you get the mother of pearl, and the fact that an oyster can only be used for 8 years. Why? Because when you take, after the first 2 years, the pearl that got created and harvested, you take it out of this little muscle pouch inside the oyster, and you reinsert another Mississippi bead from the exact size of the pearl you just got. And you do that, you can only do this 4 times. After that, the oyster is too old. And which is why when you have big pearls...
Is there a retirement home for oysters that are more than 8 years old?
Well, watch tiles. I think that's what happens.
That's what happens too. It's interesting though. I mean, you were just saying that the watch industry hasn't really taken advantage of the
storytelling behind it.
The storytelling behind it, but also, I mean, mother of pearl, yes, but I don't recall. I don't get the impression that the industry uses actual pearls all that much. And I mean, I've seen, vintage pocket watches. I mean, older than vintage pocket watches. From the 17th, less in the 18th, less in the 19th century. But 17th century certainly. You would see watch cases set with pearls, but it's not something we see so often in the industry.
We've seen a lot of mother of pearl marquetry. We've seen some like black pearls, like in different intensity, where you would see like little like light gray or some hints of light pink. You could see some, but just like the plain mother of pearl, like the white mother of pearl, we don't really see it unless you have this little like cloudy and like you move your wrist, and because of the reflection you can see that something's happening. But it's just a bit sad that the story around it would, I think, add more value into mother of pearl dial, because all of that story of how this thing have basically traveled from very far on that globe, because you cannot find a lot of black pearls else than French pearl in Asia.
Yeah, I mean, the storytelling part of it is interesting, because I think cultured pearls have been around since Mikimoto invented the process in the 1920s, I think.
Yes.
And there's a tendency when you hear that something is cultured to assume that it's kind of an open and shut process and there's no room for natural processes. You get the impression that the natural side of the process has been taken out of it, but a cultured pearl is still a pearl. I mean, you're improving the odds for yourself by using a seed pearl and by having some control over the process, but there's still a natural process that has to be gone through, and there's no way to rush it. And
there's no way to control the size, how it's going to come out, and the color, which is how natural and it's often, again, it's not the topic today, but this is usually the parallel that's being drawn with lab-grown and natural diamonds. It's like cultured pearls they're not considered fake pearls; they're still pearls. Right. So it's an interesting thing. And
I guess to sort of wrap things up with another material that has the potential to be, a little bit of a visual cliche. Meteorite. what in the execution of a meteorite dial kind of, draws your eye?
First of all, I think is the texture of it, where it's like very stiff and at the same time very textured. There's always something happening in a meteorite dial. And depending on what type of meteorite, we've seen different range of colors. Like if you think about the constellation of Omega, it has this like very interesting dial. One of the first, I've seen meteorite in one of Louis Moinet watches. So the way it's been used, it's been carved, and the choice of which meteorite is from, not necessarily the fact that it's coming from all the way up and it's like 1 million years old. It's not really this that I find interesting, is how all of a sudden it's being encapsulated into a watch dial and how it's transforming and bringing this like edgy touch to something that is mechanical, classic, traditional that we've seen in most of the dials. This is what I find interesting. And the same way goes with Opal dials. They have to take this like plate of meteorite and they just like draw parts that they wanted cut out for their dial. So it's kind of cool also the way it's being done.
Yeah, I've always gotten the impression looking at meteorite that it can be, from a design standpoint, a little bit of a challenging material to work with because it's got such a distinctive, well, iron nickel meteorite dials anyway. And as you were saying, that's not the only kind of meteorite that's available. But these angular patterns, the Widmanstätten patterns they're called, which are formed by these enormous iron nickel crystals, they're really, really assertive. And to kind of make them work in a watch, it seems to me, is a little bit of a design challenge.
Possibly, yeah. But sometimes it's also what you want to achieve and you don't want to overdo it. Sometimes the simplest things are the best one. You just need to not find an excuse, but just you want to use this, you don't need to find the justification of it. If it works well and it's just natural, if anything it's actually the hardest thing is to keep it simple. And brands tend to sometimes forget about it, whether it's storytelling or what they want to achieve with the watch.
Yeah.
But truth is, as simple as that, you get a beautiful opal from the right part, you get a beautiful mother of pearl dial from the right part, you get the beautiful turquoise from the cool variety. You've got your things. Yeah,
and just let it be itself. Let it shine on its own without adding anything that you don't need. And I mean, this is, I think, in design in general, and certainly in watch design, there's a little bit of a tendency to add that like one extra thing that you really don't need.
The extra unnecessary.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Eleonor. This is a huge subject, obviously, and in the time that we have, we've really just barely scratched the surface. It's really just the tip of the iceberg. But a fascinating introduction. I have to look up what the 70 plus different kinds of turquoise are. So thank you for sharing those insights.
I'll show you visuals of that.
Yeah,
it's gonna be hard to believe.
Yeah, let's do that. All right, thank you again. And,
you're very welcome.
Thank you, folks. We'll see you next time.